This is KPFK 90.7 FM. My name is Bob Young, and we are talking once again with Carl Oglesby. And Carl has authored a new book called The JFK Assassination, The Facts and the Theories. It's published by Signet Paperbacks and comes complete with a foreword by Norman Mailer. And it's a pleasure to talk with you again, Carl.
It's a pleasure to be here, Bob. Thanks.
And, well, I think before we get seriously into talking about the book, perhaps we should mention something that's come up in the news just of late. We have recently heard from Washington, D.C., that Dr. James Humes and J. Thornton Boswell, who were part of the JFK autopsy team at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland, have said that in point of fact, all the bullets came from the rear, and anyone who was studying all of that neat stuff in Bethesda would know that for a fact. So, Carl, you've had some comments about that. Would you like to talk about that for a moment?
It's probably, for more than a moment, it's a very important move. And for the AMA to be now in a position of having its reputation for honesty and fairness hung up in the Kennedy assassination seems to me, certainly in terms of the AMA's overall history, a fascinating moment. I'm not sure they're going to come out of this unscathed, and it looks to me, in fact, as if the AMA Journal and its editor, who's behind this, Dr. George Lundgren, I think they have already taken some raps from some surprising places, and I'm thinking of the longish review of this flap that came in yesterday's New York Times in the Science Times section, which is a very interesting place for it to be. A long, for the Times, review of the argument about the bullets, the direction of the front shots, that's now going on between Dr. Crenshaw, who says 2 shots from the front, and the Journal of the AMA, which has reviewed the old evidence and is proclaiming shots from behind. I think that to get more to the point, one of the odd things about this flap that, I mean, it really strikes me, this is in every respect, it looks like some kind of a staged operation. Their news release, which is in front of me now, says that this is Doctors Humes and Boswell's, quote, first ever public discussion of the case. And this is just elementary, incorrect information. It's not at all first ever. Humes and Boswell both gave testimony to the Warren Commission, which was utterly in public. They were examined by the members of the Warren Commission. They didn't just as they have done now, utter a few oracular words and then disappear. And then they talked also to the Ramsey Clark panel in the later 60s. They talked to the Rockefeller Commission. I believe they talked to the Select Committee on Assassinations. In any case, they have, and on several occasions, said in public the very same kind of things now that they're being represented by the AMA as presenting to us for the first time. This is ridiculous. Then they say a public discussion. I'm sorry, I don't see what's public about it. Dr. Lundgren has presented the views of Humes and Boswell as though they had been handed down to him from Olympus. But other than that, Humes and Boswell have, as usual, declined to present themselves for public interrogation on this case, or any other case for that matter. These guys just don't talk in public about this in that sense, in the sense of being interrogated, or in the sense of having to discuss their issues. So it's not a public discussion either. So, I mean, what kind of points are you going to give to the AMA when it sets this thing up on such a false foundation? They say that big deal. Humes and Boswell agreed at last to talk in the venue of the Journal of the AMA because the interview was in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. I wonder what kind of peers could have been involved in the review of this article. They talked to only a very few people who were in a position to have had first-hand information of the wounds, whether at the autopsy table in Bethesda late that Friday or earlier in the trauma room at Parkland. They didn't talk to everybody. They falsified the record of statements on the part of many of their best witnesses. For example, they say Dr. Perry, the Parkland Trama Room doctor who made the tracheostomy, the incision in the front of the president's throat, they quote Dr. Perry as saying that he has always said the wounds came from the front and that the tracheostomy looked the same, according to pictures he's seen, when the body reached the autopsy room as it did when it left the trauma room. But all you have to do is to go back to what he told newspaper reporters as well as what he told the Warren Commission to see that this is absolutely false. All the Parkland doctors, in the beginning, or at least who got on the journalistic record, said without exception or without the slightest appearance of hesitation that the shots to Kennedy that were on target were fired from in front of him. One of them hit him in the throat and the necktie area, and the other hit him in the head and killed him.
And, well, for those who don't know, Dr. Charles Crenshaw was a man who, at the time, was a young resident at the trauma room in Parkland, and he recently came out with a book entitled Conspiracy of Silence, which states very clearly and very emphatically that not only did the shots come from the front, but the enlarged wound that has been seen by a number of people on JFK's throat was significantly larger than the way Dr. Perry left it when the body left Parkland.
Well, yes, it's on that point now that Perry is now trying to rebut Crenshaw. He says that from the picture, from the pictures at the autopsy, that wound in the throat looked to him the same as it did in Dallas. So, I mean, if he's the guy that did it, and that's how this thing is going to stand or fall, then Crenshaw has been, one would have to say, rebutted. Not to say that Perry's memory is perfect, and above all, not to say that there isn't indications of contrary evidence in the record. But still, on the whole, Crenshaw, it seems to me, is recovering from the attack against him launched by the AMA Journal. And I would cite as some kind of evidence for this two things. First, the New York Times editorial of a couple of days ago, which jubilantly announced two shots from the rear, in one column said, okay, now would you guys all shut up and sit down already about this assassination conspiracy? How many times do we have to listen to this preposterous nonsense? But then in the second column it said, and just to keep things quiet for a while, let's have the government go ahead and release these files, and let's look into the questions that have been raised by honest and fair-minded assassination conspiracy critics or theorists. So they gave back in the second column what they had taken away with the first, in the sense that even the New York Times now is editorially on record as acknowledging the need for document releases and here and there a few key moves with the physical evidence, some new tests in certain areas. And that's all to the good. As if the Times can only say such a thing after sneering at those who have been saying the same thing for centuries, it seems like, well, too bad for the Times, but still that institution does have a certain influence, and I'm, for one, happy to see that the Times is now batting on it with the right team. And then in yesterday's Times, not to be too East Coast oriented here, but I think it's kind of interesting what this paper does print, and what is the news it sees fit to print. In the May 26th issue, they have a long story in the science section, the Science Times section, and it's under a heading, "The Doctor's World," and it says, 28 years after Dallas, a doctor tells his story amid troubling doubts. It's a review of the Crenshaw argument. It talks about Crenshaw, his book. It talks about this attack on Crenshaw that's recently been published by the Journal of the AMA, and it gives, for the first time that I've seen in print, some of Crenshaw's personal reactions to the situation that's come up. And it by no means trashes him. In fact, the Journal of the AMA people come in for a bit of a trashing. The New York Times author of this piece, himself an MD, wants to know why, if they were to take 7 years, as they have claimed, to do this scrupulous study of the medical evidence as reported by the medical witnesses, did they only bother to talk to a meager handful of the people whom they might have reached out to? Why didn't they talk to Crenshaw? He was in the room. Why didn't they talk to the nurses, for example, who had such dramatic testimony of a shot from the front and of irreconcilable large amounts of lead being taken out of Connolly's body and the rest? There was no attempt to reach out to the large base of people who had concrete first-hand evidence to contribute.
Yeah, because overall there were I believe it was over 30 people in the trauma room at Parkland, most of whom saw the body. And in fact, a nurse who, if I recall correctly, I think her name was Nancy Bowen, was at the president's head at the time that his life signs were starting to diminish. And she said quite clearly that the back of his head was gone. What do you think is behind this current pose by JAMA?
That's the kind of question you really can't discuss without venturing into levels of accusation that ought not be made, or levels of suspicion that ought not be publicly voiced unless the evidentiary base is much stronger. I would say for preliminaries and for the rock bottom minimal interpretation is that the JAMA people have somehow been taken for a ride. This Dr. Lundberg has managed to convince himself, or has been convinced somebody, that he knows the case and is in a position to discuss it publicly as an expert. I assume by this time he has been disabused of this conceit. In any case, the JAMA's effort to shut the thing down is, I think, already clearly crashed in flames. The motive for it must have been to refute Crenshaw. Crenshaw's book, Conspiracy of Silence, was published, as I think, in February. It might have been out in January, but I'm sure it was already out in February. It was being written about, discussed, I believe, in March. And despite the fact that the book is, I think, rather badly made and it lacks the overall seriousness that such a book should have, and that is a contribution of the book's co-authors, it nevertheless does contain, on maybe at the outset 5 pages out of the less than 200 pages in the book, it does contain important new information about what happened in the autopsy given, or in the emergency room, that is given to us by a man who was there and had a hands-on relationship with the body, who was medically trained to understand what he saw, and who has kept quiet all these years for, as I see it, what is a believable reason, namely that there was enormous pressure within the medical community in Dallas, and I suppose nationally, that the people who had in any way seen the body or treated the president in that whole process from emergency room to and through the autopsy process should keep maximally quiet about what they saw and should never give the least impression that they were trying to capitalize on their experience, or worse yet, to sensationalize it. And this, given the professional character of the institutions involved, to my mind, readily explains the fact that we haven't heard from this important body of witnesses in any real way, and therefore lend a certain drama to Crenshaw's appearance earlier this year with the story that they saw in that room evidence of shots from the front, and they have been quiet about it all these years because they were a part of a, quote, conspiracy of silence. It's logical that a guy who says something like this about people who are still living and up and about and have reputations to worry about and points of view to protect and access to media people, it's very understandable that there should be an answering salvo. And what we saw with JAMA was an answering salvo. I can't believe that salvo was organized altogether by the people who pretended to be Crenshaw's victims, that is to say, chiefly Doctors Humes and Boswell, who were responsible for the autopsy. I can't believe that these guys took it in their own hands to go out now and seek a vindication before a broader audience. Moreover, Lundgren has implied that this project was something like 7 years from conception to completion. That in itself, as I've indicated, raises a lot of questions. Was it in the beginning? Was this project launched in the beginning to answer and refute David Lifton, who published a very important book about that time, Best Evidence, arguing that the body of the president was somehow surgically altered between the time it left the trauma room at Parkland and the time it arrived some 6 hours later on the autopsy table at Bethesda. This is what Lifton claims. And people who are trying to avoid coming to terms with that very painful issue are visible in this JAMA piece, making the most spurious kind of moves to get off that hook. The doctors, the autopsy doctors, Humes and Boswell, for example, huff and puff that they never surgically altered anything, and they act like if only they could catch this Lifton, they would, or Crenshaw, who also suggests that there's been surgery done to the body. They suggest that they would punch these guys right out if only they could get to them. Well, the issue is not did the autopsy surgeons change the wounds? Nobody said that. Lifton doesn't say that. Lifton is saying that it appears from the record as though the wounds were changed sometime between the body's departure from Texas and its arrival in Maryland.
Right, sometime in transit.
He doesn't know, although it would seem that the suspects must be rather limited, since the possession of the body could be pretty well defined through that whole period. But anyway, come back to this JAMA bit. It looks to me as though this project, if indeed it is 7 years old, as Lundgren likes to say now, it must have been formed up in the beginning as an answer to Lifton. And then I bet it fell apart because they couldn't find a consensus to support their crazy and fantastical views of the assassination. In other words, the Warren Commission theory. They could not find enough people to back that up, and maybe they even talked to some people who didn't back it up. Well, they did. They talked at least to one doctor, one surgeon, McClellan, also a veteran of the trauma room, who joins Crenshaw in saying that there was evidence of front shots. So maybe what happened was the JAMA project was launched to destroy Lifton, found out that it could not destroy Lifton, was put back in a closet. Then when Crenshaw appeared to say basically the same things, much more simply and in a way much more powerfully than Lifton ever could, then the old anti-Lifton project at JAMA is dusted off and put in as good a shape as possible and launched before an admiring public, hoping that all the old prejudices will kick in and that the journalistic folks out there, the media folks, so hot to find evidence of no conspiracy, will get the cue and play it up. And that's exactly what happened. It did get played up as though it were a big deal, as though Humes and Boswell have not been saying in several occasions, exactly the same thing as they're now represented as saying for the first time. They've always said this. Now, that comes to the question of what they say and how we can relate to their idea of the state of the wounds, but that kind of goes into another area, and you may think I'm beginning to make a speech at you, so I'll shut up at that point.
No, that's okay. It's your interview, but also one should note, at the original press conference where Lundberg read the findings of the journal, he brought up, I think in answer to a reporter's question, that, well, I have some question as to whether Dr. Crenshaw was even in the trauma room. I've talked to several people who can't recall seeing him there, and yet
Yes.
Dr. McClellan, Dr. Perry...
Point. I'm glad you made that point, because that underscores, it highlights, it jabs right in your eye the incredible pompousness, the pretentiousness, the falsity with which Lundberg is claiming scientific credentials for this article. Uh-huh. There is nothing scientific whatsoever in the attitude that says you have to denounce and disgrace your opposition. Crenshaw's presence in the trauma room is established as a matter of absolute fact, and no one who spends 2 minutes with this issue could be in the least doubt about it. If Lundberg pretends, for purely polemical purposes at this point, to be in doubt of Crenshaw's presence in the trauma room, he exposes himself as either a charlatan or a fool. You can take your pick.
Interesting choices there. But yes, in fact, I believe it's David Lifton's book, Best Evidence, that includes a photograph which quite clearly shows Dr. Crenshaw in attendance in the trauma room at the time.
Yeah, there's no question about it. He's in the index to the Warren Commission. He was interviewed. Not before the commission, but people talked to him.
Right. I think Wesley Liebler was one of the ones who talked with him. But on to another subject, and that is your new book, The JFK Assassination, The Facts and the Theories. And I'd like to remind the audience once again, this is Bob Young. I'm talking with Carl Oglesby, who... let's see, Carl, during the mid-1970s, you were involved in a group called the Assassination Information Bureau, and a lot of the information that you people collected has become the basis of this book. And would you like to tell us a little bit about AIB?
Oh, yeah. I was just coming myself. I was coming out of a rather bitter experience with the anti-war movement, which had done fine in the middle 60s when I was very active with Students for a Democratic Society. I was a national officer of SDS, in fact, in that period, and was very much out front in the movement against the war. That's how I got into offbeat politics to begin with. Then, not to go into too much detail about that, but people who know about that period know that at the end of the 60s, a sweethearted and open-minded and democratically organized student movement ran afoul of an internal faction or two that felt like they ought to take over the levers of power and move everything underground for the coming battle with a collapsing imperial state. And SDS, in effect, got destroyed, and that meant that out-front people like me didn't really have a continuing role to play with that part of the movement. I came to Cambridge, Mass. at that point and started trying to put together another set of political ideas. And a theme that became very important to me was thinking about the Vietnam experience. I was consistently drawn back to the question of how the big Vietnam War got going. Was Kennedy actually pointing us in this direction before he got killed, or was a new policy instituted by the new President Johnson? And again, to abbreviate, I concluded that as far as I could read the evidence, Kennedy was about to come out of Vietnam, that he had, in effect, said to his people, all right, to the military people, if you can maintain these kinds of purposes, this kind of presence for the United States in Vietnam by the expenditure of a certain level of force and we're talking the special forces, the Green Berets, military advisors, equipment assistance, and that sort of thing, but not the direct use of American combat troops. If you can achieve the objectives of holding up the friendly, if right-wing government in Saigon, if you can do it that way, go ahead and do it. But if it's going to cost more than that, then don't try. Don't spend any more blood. Don't spend any more treasure. I think that was Kennedy's basic position. Not very idealistic, very pragmatic. And I don't know if he was killed in order that the Vietnam War take place. I would have a lot of trouble in saying that I believed that. But on the other hand, I do believe that his death was necessary to the escalation, the radical escalation of the Vietnam War that we saw in the period after his death.
Well, we would have to also point out that there were a number of major U.S. corporations that certainly would not be as major as they are today had it not been for the Vietnam War.
Oh, there's no question that the war had a constituency in American politics. There's no question about it, and I worked for a member of that constituency. At the moment that Kennedy was killed, I was happily ensconced in the military-industrial complex as the senior editor of a group, the sort of the straw boss of a department of technical editors and writers at a place called Bendix Aerospace Systems Division in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Yes.
It was a military engineering outfit, and we were working on military projects at the very hour of the Kennedy assassination. In fact, there was considerable disgruntlement about Kennedy around there and throughout the industry.
Yes.
I don't know how justified it was. I see that the statistical argument about what Kennedy was and was not going to do in terms of military expenditures is ambiguous and hard to follow, and I wouldn't want to represent myself as an expert on that part of it. But I can say that definitely the mood within the part of the industry that I saw or was aware of in my job on the inside of it, the mood was very definitely anti-Kennedy. I mean, there was an extreme grudge against him. There was a sense that his policies were hurting the United States. He wasn't tough enough on Cuba. He backed down at the Bay of Pigs. He let Khrushchev push him around, and here he was talking about peaceful coexistence all the time, and didn't he know that these commies needed to have it shoved in their faces, and wasn't it going to get us into an awful lot of trouble to go further down this road? That was a very ordinary opinion about President Kennedy in my workaday world as of 1963. And as soon as he was gone and Johnson was in, the mood turned around like you would hit a light switch, and with good reason. I saw our contracts very soon, in a matter of months, start pumped up again, and then by beginning of 1965, I was out of there and in the anti-war movement.
And of course, by 1965, at that particular time, Lyndon Johnson was escalating the Vietnam War.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm getting way away from my story here, though, about how the AIB got founded. I wanted to be brief about it. You see how many things are involved in it.
We're talking American history here, Carl, and it's
Wait,
it's all of a piece.
72 or 73, I'm in Cambridge, resettled with a new group of friends, and I started to write a column for the Boston Phoenix, a street weekly. And in the column, I started writing about the Kennedy assassination, and drew the attention of a very bright guy, also a young journalist with a movement background named Bob Katz, who had, in fact, tuned into the importance of the JFK case somewhat earlier than I, and had set up already an organization, a small group of folks, just really himself and two other guys, who were traveling around the country with a slideshow and on the Kennedy case showing the evidence, and a bootleg copy of the Zapruder film, which at that point had not been seen at all by very many people, and was always a way to draw big crowds because people were fascinated by what this movie might show them about the Kennedy case. And Katz and his two friends, David Williams and Harvey Azijian, were traveling the country, crisscrossing it, I may say, showing to overflow audiences the Zapruder film and the material evidence in the case, and arguing that there was evidence of conspiracy and saying the case needed to be reopened by the Congress. I joined in with these three guys, and together we created something that we were pleased to call the Grassy Knoll Debating Society. And the Grassy Knoll Debating Society would get together very often, several times a day sometimes, to talk about this case and to figure out what we should be trying to do. One thing that we did was we put on a conference at Boston University that was very widely and favorably reported, even by the New York Times. The Globe gave it front-page coverage, January 75, The Politics of Conspiracy. We talked not only about the JFK case, but about the other principal assassinations of the 60s, and the then accumulating evidence. The Church Committee, for example, on intelligence, had just published highly damaging disclosures about the CIA. And our conference was dedicated to the growth of this, of government by conspiracy within the institutions, of conspiracies formed up within the enlistment roles of organizations that are already operating under official secret cover. So that conference kind of helped put us on the map. Another thing we did was we went down to the State House and set up our JFK program, and for a week, on a more or less nonstop basis, ran through the photographic evidence with state legislators who would drop by in the committee room to check out what we had to say. At the end of that week, a resolution which we had proposed and helped to draft was passed unanimously by the state legislature here, mandating the United States Congress to reopen the case. We, by that time, were running a radio program, weekly radio program, over the station WBUR, based at Boston University here in Boston, in the Boston area. And the producer of that program, a terrific guy by the name of Vic Wheatman, decided we needed a somewhat more publicly usable name than the Grassy Knoll Debating Society. So he suggested that we call ourselves the Assassination Information Bureau, and that was the name of our weekly program. We would have the air for an hour at a good time in the evening to talk to people who had just published books or who were doing research or had some other interest in the general area of the Kennedy assassination, and also the larger question of the welfare of constitutional government in an era when clandestine organizations were proliferating. So that was a theme, I think, that struck home to people at that time, and we got a very good listenership built up. Became the AIB in an out-front way, changed our structure and started inviting people to come join us, although we never did concede control over our decisions. That was always a matter for the, well, at its biggest, maybe 8 or 9 people were a part of our collective. We had all come out of the movement and seen what damage can be done to an organization that loses control of its decision-making powers, and none of us wanted to go through that again. So our mode of organizing was that of the collective, but then we invited people to form collectives of their own, and we published a newsletter, and we tried to operate as an information clearinghouse and do the other kinds of housekeeping sort of chores that need to be done if a widely held feeling within the population is ever going to have the political clarity of the thing we call a movement. Well, then, in 1976, the Congress did start moving towards an investigation. It could hardly not, since the air was thick with conspiracies. Nixon had just fallen in the great disgrace of Watergate. everybody and his brother was at that point a conspiracy theorist, if not about the JFK case, then certainly about the state of government itself. So it would have been, I suppose, amazing if the Congress had not felt an enormous pressure at that point to reopen the Kennedy case, and also the assassination of Martin Luther King, about which also there are lots of reasons to suppose that the official theory, no conspiracy theory, is wrong.
Well, in fact, I think one could safely say that there were no political assassinations during the, especially the mid to late 60s, that don't raise some rather startling questions.
Yes,
and,
it's true. The Robert Kennedy assassination, just as with the King, in fact, maybe the case in the Bobby Kennedy murder is even more startlingly clear. I mean, the case for conspiracy.
Well, we'll get into that at some other time. Right at the moment, I think we should probably stick with your book. It's a wonderful collection of material, and I noticed that most of it originally appeared in the Assassination Information Bulletin.
Right. When we, along with other groups and individuals, I'm not trying to steal all the glory for the AIB, but we were a part of the movement that did get the Congress finally to react and set up the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And at that point, we in the AIB collective decided that it was appropriate for us now to move our office from Cambridge to Washington, and to try to play the role of informed citizens watchdog over the behavior of the Assassinations Committee. We thought that there was an audience out there that would want better, more detailed, and more sophisticated coverage of the Assassinations Committee than they could find in the newspapers or even in the journals. So we managed to raise a little bit of money, and it always was a little bit. I look back and see how much we got done and how little money. It seems amazing to me. But anyway, a couple of us went to Washington and set up an office for the AIB and opened up a kind of AIB safe house that became a way station for people moving through the area and who were interested in these kind of things. So I think we did a pretty good job at becoming a center for the exchange of views and information, and I think we also succeeded in making the Select Committee staff, investigative staff, aware of the existence of a community of concerned researchers. Yes, not all of them lawyers, not all of them trained in the best technical and scientific colleges, but smart people who had grabbed hold of interesting themes in this case and dedicated considerable time and energy and ingenuity in researching them, and who had something important to contribute. And the committee ought not to let itself be browbeaten by that lawyerly feeling that if a lawyer didn't find it out, it can't be true. So I think that to a certain degree, to a good degree, we were fairly successful at that, building a bridge from the community of independent researchers to the Select Committee investigative staff. And one of the things that we did, too, was to help keep people nationally informed on what was happening. We published a very substantive newsletter called Clandestine America. We put it out, I think, maybe 8, 9, 10 issues over that essentially 2-year period. Then at the end of 1978, the committee in public hearings presented evidence that it found conclusive as to conspiracy. Well, you can't say conclusive because the language of the final report says that the committee found conspiracy in the case of JFK probable. So they were not willing to say that absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt there were 2 guns firing in Dealey Plaza. But the committee had discovered technical evidence, the so-called acoustics evidence, which did persuade it at the time that it had to give a vote for probable conspiracy, and that is to say the case is open again, folks. Lee Harvey Oswald didn't do it, or at least he didn't do it alone. We don't know who he was connected with or what was behind him, if he was an assassin or if he was a patsy. It scarcely makes any difference. We don't know anything about him. We cannot reliably and confidently interpret his real role in this case. We need a new investigation, and we need the government to put its heart and soul into it for once and stop running from the thing. I thought that at that point in early 1979, when that deal was sort of out on the table, I thought, well, the AIB, the Assassination Information Bureau, has done what it came to do. We started out 6 years before with the idea that there was a latent public demand for an honest new look at the question, who killed JFK? And, for that matter, who killed King? And we started out on the proposition that if a fair-minded, technically competent investigative staff would look at the evidence in these two cases, it would be compelled by the standards of reason and logic to conclude that a conspiracy was at least an important possibility in each case. And indeed, that's what the committee did discover. That's what they concluded. A conspiracy was probable in the case of JFK and likely, as the committee worded it, in the case of King. Now, my feeling, after all that I had lived through at that time, I cannot understand how I could have been so naive. And maybe it wasn't that I was naive. Maybe we were all not naive. Maybe we were just tired because it had taken something out of us to do this. It was a major effort. So we decided in the AIB collective that we had done what we came to town to do, and there was no reason for us to stick around and try to live off our laurels and define some new role. Now the case was open. Now official organs of inquiry at the executive level would necessarily kick in, and the thing that we wanted to see happen would happen. The rock would fall down the mountain. But what do you know? It didn't. It got hung up. And the new investigation never did take place. The Justice Department looked at one little bit of the technical evidence, the acoustics evidence, and decided through tests and a bit of a fluke that the evidence wasn't any good, and did not compel belief in the hypothesis of a shot from the front. And as far as the Justice Department was concerned, that was that. There was no other credible evidence of conspiracy. It saw no new evidence that it had to look into. The acoustics was now refuted, and everybody could go back to sleep about it. Kennedy was killed by one lone nut, and there was no big conspiracy to be found. Well, that's sort of in the mid-'80s that was happening, and Brother Reagan was secure in the saddle, and it did seem to those of us who had spent the 70s and some of us even back into the 60s caring about this so much, we're now in a period where there wasn't a whole lot that we could do. We could pursue our own independent research projects and write our books and keep the flames of inquiry alive in the popular marketplace, but there didn't seem anything that we could do at an official level to move the case ahead. Then came Oliver Stone and JFK, and as you and your audience have well perceived, suddenly the thing was burningly alive again, with everyone seemingly taking up the argument, and the issue has hardly for a day been out of the public eye in the 6 months or so, well, a little more than that, since the attack on Stone's JFK began well before the movie was released in December.
Yes, yes. In fact, the attack on the movie began while while the film was still in the process of production, before they had even rolled a camera on it,
Right.
on the basis of what Stone now says was a stolen first draft of the script.
Yeah. Sooner or later, people who take unfair advantage of the record and try to distort people's positions, they're going to pay a price for it. I think that the Washington Post crowd behind George Lardner and Time Magazine and the rest who joined in that howlingly fiendish attack on Stone and his poor screenplay. I mean, all of that energy, if it's not going to sink home and kill the guy that it's targeted on, it's going to rebound. And why do people not understand that? If you're going to attack a project like this, kill it. If you're going to attack a guy like Stone, stop what he's doing. If you're just going to fiddle around with it, if you're just going to irritate the beast, all you're doing in the end is preparing a hotbed of public awareness, which is exactly what Oliver Stone and this movie project needed. In fact, if you look back at this whole period, from last fall up through the release of the movie in the wintertime, when this attack was coming down from Time, from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, who not? What would a publicity agent have been paid who could have generated that kind of advance publicity for a movie?
It's true.
Oliver Stone had sat down with the most the shrewdest conspiracy in the world to figure out what's the best way to market his movie. I can't see how he'd have hit on a better path than the one that was actually taken.
No, because certainly virtually every book that was ever written about the JFK assassination is either in print or back in print right at the moment, all the way from Sylvia Meagher to Colonel Fletcher Prouty. Practically everything is there available for the public now, and the public, from the response at bookstores and libraries, seems to be gobbling it up. Anyway, once again, before we, I have something I definitely want to ask you here in a moment, Carl, but I thought I'd better remind the listeners that this is KPFK 90.7 FM. We're talking once again with Carl Ogelsby, the author of a new book from Signet Paperback called The JFK Assassination, The Facts and the Theories. And something that I've been hearing a lot of lately since I've been pouring myself back into this case after a lot of years, just assuming that it was hopeless, a number of people have accused me of rampant paranoia. That, this government couldn't possibly keep a secret that long, that big.
We're not talking about the government.
No, we're not. We're talking about individuals. We're also talking about, as far as government conspiracy goes, let's face it, there are still questions about the Lincoln assassination that have never been adequately answered. And that's 120 years ago. But you start your book with an article from a lecture at MIT in 1973 called Paranoia as a Way of Knowing. And I found that fascinating because it answers so many of the questions about paranoia. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
I think that it is so weak-minded for someone to say something like, you're a paranoid, if they catch you in the act of trying to piece together the secret dimension of government power. I mean, in the first place, come on, paranoia, if it has any real meaning, has meaning within the domain of psychiatric observation, and it has no real place in political discourse. It's just a dirty word that's thrown out when somebody is befuddled by the evidence that you're trying to adduce, and they don't want to deal with that. So as far as I'm concerned, if somebody wants to just come with one single blow, let us know that he is not serious about this case, then let him just throw the word paranoia around as though he were telling anybody anything or answering any real questions.
It's not really a sane charge, even. It's just a case of, oh, you're paranoid, which means I don't want to discuss it anymore.
I think that there's a reason for that. I think that the liberal tradition, especially, which lives on perhaps better in our newspapers than in our governmental institutions, our press, our media, have something really deeply invested in the idea that they are telling us generally the truth about the world on a day-by-day basis, right? That, they may miss a little bit of a story here and there, or one or the other of them may get a fact wrong someplace else, but they'll soon be corrected. All stories that are stories are treated as stories, and if a story that you thought was a good story is not visible in the press, you don't see it there, then you were wrong to think that it was a story. This was true of the escalation of Vietnam, as the experience of Halberstam with the New York Times made clear. Halberstam, in the mid-'60s, starts seeing the evidence of a new U.S. role in Vietnam and of gathering strength on the part of the enemy. And he starts wondering aloud who this enemy is, because on the theory that the enemy is the enemy of the Vietnamese people, then the enemy should not be gaining the inroads into the confidence of the Vietnamese people. That is apparent. Well, this was a story that was a non-story. And if you tried to tell it, you became a non-person. Halberstam, with all his prizes, became a non-reporter for the New York Times when he started telling a non-story that turned out nevertheless to be the truth. Now, what I'm trying to say is that the media operate in terms of assumptions about what they take the world to be. Assumptions about what they imagine the agenda of important stories is from moment to moment. They take a lot of pride, and they demand a lot of space and respect and latitude on the assumption that the world that they report corresponds in all the important particulars to the world that's actually out there. Now here comes the little paranoid freak, nut, buff, who has dared to look at 2 or 3 sources on the Kennedy assassination and compare them, and has seen the anomalies in the official record, has noted that the Warren Commission evidence for its case does not add up to anything like a proof, and that has allowed his little silly moronic mind to become bothered about this. And one of the high and mighty people at the Washington Post and in the New York Times and at CBS and NBC and ABC, what are the lords and ladies of the great news establishment going to say to this skinny little scrawny nut with his 2 or 3 contradictory facts? Get out of here, kid.
Yeah.
And that's what the media have been trying to say to the critics on this case for decades. It's just now, in the dust-up since the JFK movie, that a new fact is beginning to emerge, which gives me considerable hope, which is that the people within the community of the media who are now beginning to get the bylines and to get in the important local TV news seats and to have a certain edge in experience, seniority, and so on, and who were never committed before to the defense of the Warren Commission theory, these people are starting to move into positions of influence, and they are open to the conspiracy theory. I think this is why even in the New York Times, just yesterday, on Tuesday, the story about Crenshaw is so much fairer than anything that I've seen the Times produce so far. Here they had Crenshaw's neck on a chopping block. It was only necessary to send one of the usual journalistic assassins that they have working for them, and the Times could have dispatched the Crenshaw case once and for all. They didn't do it. They, in effect, raised questions about the AMA attack on Crenshaw. They raised questions about the care with which that attack had been prepared and carried off. They reestablished that Crenshaw was indeed in the trauma room and did have an opportunity to experience what he did, what he said he did. They even established that Crenshaw was called to the phone by a mysterious caller from outside the hospital. This is the caller whom Crenshaw takes to have been Lyndon Johnson, telling him this is in the autopsy on Oswald, that they wanted on Kennedy rather, that they wanted a lone assassin model of the crime. So Crenshaw is vindicated on several points, and I think restored to credibility as an important witness on this matter. And this by the New York Times. I would not have imagined that this would happen 10 years ago and under similar circumstances. It just wouldn't have happened this way. So I think that to a certain extent, even though it seems sometimes that progress is so slow as to be not progress at all, the fact is that there is progress, and that the people who have been trying to find out the truth on this thing and to keep the issue in the public eye are, bit by bit, as time goes by, overall being vindicated. And vindicated in the only way that really makes a difference, and that is in the eyes of American opinion.
Yeah, because one does have to point out that, in fact, over 80% of the people of the United States believe that JFK was shot by a conspiracy, that Lee Harvey Oswald was perhaps involved in the conspiracy, but certainly not a major player. And that's over 80% of the people of the country.
It's a huge number. I think if you check it, it might be 82% of those with an opinion.
Yeah.
And there are about 15% who, strangely enough, have no opinion on the matter. So, in any case, it's a huge majority, and it has held for years. It's not as if this is just a spike on a graph. This is a long flat line that's been up around 70%, 75% since early in the 1970s. The American people gave the Warren Commission a chance. They listened to it. For a moment, they accepted it. If you watch the movement of the opinion polls right after Warren comes out in 1964 with the report, it got a pretty generally soft treatment at the press, at the hands of the press, which was not inclined to raise a lot of questions about people of the probity of Earl Warren and Richard Russell and Allen Dulles and the like.
Allen Dulles, yes.
But then, just to finish that thought, after that little dip in which people bought it, they started looking more carefully and listening to the critics, and right away went to a majority critical, and it's been majority critical ever since.
I would like to mention again that Carl Ogilsby is the author of The JFK Assassination, Facts and Theories. He also, for those of you who are into it, has another book that came out recently from Odonian Press in Northern California called Who Killed JFK? And I think between the two of them, you can spend a lot more and get a lot less information from other sources. So I think these are both worthwhile, and I think well worth your time. Anything you'd like to wrap on, Carl? Just to finish off?
It's always a pleasure to talk with you, old man, and I know that this case will continue to evolve, and I know that we'll talk some more.
I have no doubt.
We'll end it on that note, to be continued.
Okay, well, thank you once again for joining us, and I hope all is well back in Cambridge, and we will, as you say, we will talk again in the near future. Carl Ogilsby, thank you very much.